Next, we're going to reassemble our brake components. Now, a lot of people who don't care for drum brakes, this is the part they struggle with the most. They have trouble getting the components to stay in place, keep pieces from falling off. What I'm going to show you is the steps that I have found that are the easiest, simplest way that will help prevent pieces from scattering all over the floor. Now, you'll also notice that these are not the same steps. It's not a reverse order of what we disassembled it in. It's a bit different. First, what I recommend is whatever brake shoe attached to the parking brake arm is the first brake shoe we want to put on the vehicle. And in this case, that is the secondary shoe towards the rear. We're going to start by attaching that to the parking brake arm again using the E-clip. Now the E-clip, when you put it on there, you can slide it on there and possibly push it on with a flat blade of a screwdriver, or you could use pliers and squeeze it and get it to clip into place. Just like that. And that is going to then hold that parking brake arm secured to the brake shoe. Just make sure it's fully seated, like so. Next step is going to be to pin this brake shoe to the backing plate assembly. Now, if you remember when we disassembled it, this was also the brake shoe that included our self-adjuster arm. So we want to make sure we put that in place. Now, when we took it off, this little spring came off at the same time. We're going to install it without the spring and put that spring back in place later. We're going to hold this up in place, put the retainer through it. I'm going to let it just hang there for a moment. We have the pin that we'll put in from the back. And we have the retaining spring. We're going to use that same retainer tool. So I'm going to get this positioned in the tool already. Line up the groove so I can see through the little window of the tool to tell when I'm in place. Set that to the side here. And I'm going to place the pin through the back. Now with the pin, I'm going to need to keep one hand in place, keeping a finger on that so it stays pushed all the way out. I can kind of wrap my fingers around the brake shoe to hold that in place. Then I'm going to use my other hand and finger to hold that spring in there. And I can get that pushed up in place. I'm going to slide that on, give it a quarter turn, and get that locked in place. At this point now, it might wiggle, but this shoe is held to the backing plate and will not come off. Now one step, I realized that we forgot before that, is to lubricate the components. Before you put these shoes on, you want to use a grease. I often use disc brake caliper grease. It has a little brush in it. And you're going to paint these raised pads on the backing plate. You want to lubricate those. You want to lubricate them for that shoe that we just put on. I can pull it away and slide it behind there. Or hopefully you do this before you put the shoe in place. And the other thing you want to lubricate is the self-adjuster. This self-adjuster, you want to make sure the threads work smoothly. So you want to unthread that, lubricate the threads with this grease or sometimes never sees, and then put it back together to make sure those are lubricated. Those are really the only parts of drum brakes that need to be lubricated. Our next step is going to be to install the other shoe, but when we do that, we're going to install the self-adjuster and the retaining spring all at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this self-adjuster, put it across here, and hook this spring as well. Now that spring is going to attach to the other brake shoe, so I'm going to get that in place. And what I can do, that we don't need a tool here, is I'm going to lift that self-adjuster up in place and use this other brake shoe like a lever and pull it out, stretching that spring, and then swing it up into place. I'll repeat that motion again. So I hook the spring on there, that it's held between the two shoes. I took the self-adjuster, put it in there in the right orientation, and I swung this shoe, making sure it's locked in the proper groove, and slid that up in place. In most cases, that spring tension will now hold that brake shoe in place while I get the next retainer in. I'm going to take the other retainer, the pin, as well well as the spring and the clip. I'm going to use the brake spring retainer tool again. Hold that on with a single finger. Put the pin through the retainer. In some cases, you got to lift the shoe up into place. Push it on, give it a quarter turn, and make sure it's properly engaged in the retainer. Now the shoes are held and they will not fall off of there. This point is a good time to put this spring, the return spring, in for the self-adjuster. We can push that up in place and it'll hold itself there. And it is also the proper time to install the parking, well actually we're going to hold off a step, sorry. The parking brake strut could be installed now, but sometimes when you put on the next spring it will fall off on the ground. So we're better off if we wait one more step. We're now going to install the link and the spring for the adjuster arm. That's the one that goes behind. And don't forget to put the anchor plate on that goes behind that spring. We're going to put that in place. We're going to keep the spring hooked on here. Take the link. You might have to push the adjuster arm down, but you're going to hook it behind it. And we're going to hook the spring in to the shoe as well. It might be helpful to hook that spring in first, and you can slide that link down enough to get that spring engaged, just like that. Now this is where our brake spring pliers comes in handy once again. This side was the removal tool, this side is the installation tool. This becomes a nice lever that has two hook jaws on the end that we're going to clip over the anchor pin and pull that spring into place. Now in this case, we're going to go through that loop with the self-adjuster, wearing safety glasses once again, and we're going to stretch this up right into place. It will pop off the tool, but notice it's held right where it should be on the anchor pin. Another thing you want to make sure of is that the shoe is properly engaged with the push rod of the wheel cylinder. I know it's tough to see, has that little push rod in there. You want to make sure that's in the ears. If it's not, you can work that back a little bit to get it properly engaged. Looks like this side is properly engaged. Now is when we want to install that parking brake strut. Put that across. Notice this one shoe can still pull away to give us plenty of clearance. Make sure that's engaged on the parking brake arm and on the other shoe. We're also going to line up the push rod on this shoe as well. Remember, always make sure you're putting the primary and secondary shoes on the correct side, otherwise you would have to start over. In this case, the one with the longer lining, the secondary is towards the back like it should be. And now we have our parking brake strut engaged in the correct location, as well as our push rod for the wheel cylinder. We are left with only one more piece to install, which is our final return spring. We're going to hook that in the shoe. There's it goes down in this lower hole here. Going to use the brake spring pliers again. Take the installation tool, flip it over the anchor pin, and pull it up and out in place there. Now we have our brake shoes and hardware installed. We want to make the final inspection. Like I said before, check, make sure your shoe's on correctly, make sure the springs are in proper position, but the push rods are still properly engaged. Everything looks good here. Now notice I have my star wheel adjuster collapsed all the way. That made it a little easier to install, but if we installed our brake drum at this point, our brakes would be extremely loose. They require adjustment before the vehicle can be used. This is where that resetting tool comes into play. This is a great time saver for technicians that you can open it up. Try and hold this up so you can see it. Open this up in the drum, set it to the diameter of the drum. I don't really care what the scale reads, I'm just going straight across. At this point, the two bottom jaws are the size of the drum, and so is this part of it. I can then take this and slide it over the brake shoes, up and down, and I can adjust my brake shoes out by turning the star wheel to get that out until they are the proper size or the same size as the drum, which is going to allow that drum to be in proper adjustment or very close to it when I put it together. That saves the technician time in trying to use a star wheel adjuster from the back to tighten it up. You'll still want to check it, do a final check once the drum is slid on, but this allows you to get very close before the drum is installed. Once you have it out to the right size where these fit snugly between there, which they just do right there, I can feel it hitting on both sides. You're going to take and install the drum over the studs. Just feel a little tension from my contact with the brake shoes. If it's too much, you may have to back off that star wheel adjuster, which we may have to do here. Just a little bit. Make sure the shoes are centered up. Slide it on. Now the brakes are assembled.